Hi, and welcome to the Governance, Law, and Economics lecture series. My name is Derek Yonai, and I'm the director of the Koch Center for Leadership and Ethics at Emporia State University. The Governance, Law, and Economics lecture series is designed to highlight the three institutions that must work together to support and defend a free civil society. Those institutions are good governance, the rule of law, and market-based institutions. For those of you who are familiar with our GLE lecture series, this year we're going to do things just a little bit differently. We're going to record a half-hour lecture from our guest speaker, and then a week after we launch it, we will be having a live Q&A session with them from 6 to 6:30. And we'll have a link for that so you can join us at the end of the video. So again, we're doing things a little bit differently to be able to socially distance and still be able to provide wonderful content for those of you out there. Arthur M. Diamond Jr. earned graduate degrees in philosophy and in economics from the University of Chicago, where he was also awarded a postdoctoral fellowship with Nobel laureate Gary Becker. He has been on the faculty at The Ohio State University and is now professor of economics at the University of Nebraska Omaha, where he has received awards for distinguished research and outstanding teaching. Diamond's 91 articles and reviews have appeared in a wide range of academic journals, including Economic Inquiry, the Journal of Human Resources, the Journal of Political Economy, History of Political Economy, Science, and Theory and Decision. His recent research has focused mainly on the economics of innovation, technology, and entrepreneurship, all of which feature prominently in his book, Openness to Creative Destruction, from the Oxford University Press. The book shows how life has improved through innovation, how innovation has occurred through the efforts of inventors and innovative entrepreneurs, how workers, on balance, benefit from a dynamic, innovative system, and how policies can be crafted to encourage the innovative entrepreneur to bring us more innovations. Diamond is a member of the faculty network at the Foundation for Economic Education. He is a member of the Mount Pelerin Society and a senior fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. Today, he is going to discuss innovation Unbound.
I want to thank Derek for giving me the opportunity to talk to you all about issues that matter most to me, issues related to innovation. And that's what I'm going to spend the next half hour talking about. I'll start with the innovator who's perhaps the most famous of all American innovators, and that's Thomas Edison. Edison invented the electric light and phonographs, movies, and many other great inventions. When he was and his team were trying to figure out how to make electric lights, one of the big challenges they faced was, how do we find a filament that is both going to last a long while, stay lit, and also be fairly cheap so people can afford to buy it? And they tried a whole bunch of things. Nimble trial and error was the name of the game. And they finally landed upon carbon fibers that seemed promising. So what they did was they put that in a bulb and they started testing it. And it stayed lit for a while, and so they left it, and somebody would come back every once in a while and report back to the rest of the members of the lab, the light still burns. Well, when Edison was in his final days, his son would visit him, and he would come back to the crowd of friends and well-wishers and say to them, the light still burns. Well, today, we have many people, including Tyler Cowen, the economist, and also Peter Thiel, the entrepreneur, who wonder why we don't have the inventions that they wanted to have and thought they were going to have when they were children. Flying cars and other wonderful futuristic inventions. And the answer that I basically give is that it's not that we lack Edisons. That could be one possibility, right? Maybe there was only one Edison who was ever going to be there, and we've had them. I don't think we lack inventive talent. I think the problem is we have increasingly regulated and restrained and bound our inventors and entrepreneurs. And so if we want those wonderful flying cars, we have to do something about that. And that's the subject of my book, Openness to Creative Destruction. What do we do? What are the benefits of innovation? What can we do if there are benefits, to have more of it? Now, I'm not going to be able to tell you in the time I have with you to share with you, I'm not going to be able to tell you everything that's in this book. There's some important subjects that you'll have to read the book or talk to me later about, including that I think innovation makes us better people, better ethically, better culturally. I think it's better for the environment. These are controversial issues, but I defend them in the book and don't have time to talk to you about them today. Um, but I do have time to talk to you about some of the very most important issues, and that's what I'm going to proceed to do. The benefits of innovation have been some of the benefits have been described by Deirdre McCloskey as the great fact of economic history. She's also called it the Great Enrichment. The Great Enrichment is what it basically means is that for tens of thousands of years, in this graph, there's hundreds of years, but going back tens of thousands of years, most human beings lived lives that were, in Hobbes's words, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And that went on century after century. And then all of a sudden, around the year 1800, as you can see in this graph, there started to be a really substantial change. A lot of people, especially in Europe and America, but also in other parts of the world, started to live lives that were better. Now, this graph is in terms of gross domestic product per person, and that's more material goods, and that's important. I think what's even more important about what started happening about the year 1800 is the new goods that hadn't existed before. It's not just more of the old goods that had been around, but the new goods that were created. This graph, I think, does a nice job of mentioning several of those new goods that came into existence in the wonderful 20th century, which was so fruitful of innovation. And it shows not just the names of those goods, air conditioners, washers and dryers, refrigerators, computers, televisions, air conditioning, all of that, automobiles. It tells you how fast and how far these inventions spread to ordinary people, to the rest of the, not just to, see, there's a claim made that it's only benefits the elite, that only the rich, privileged people get the new inventions. That may sometimes be true at the start, but what this graph shows is that within a period of time, sometimes slower, sometimes faster, it spreads almost a lot of these lines come close to the top, right? Can you see that? It's close to the 100%, and it spreads substantially. Now, how does that happen? I have a chapter in the book on process innovations. Process innovations reduce the price, the cost of making the goods, and therefore that passes on to consumers at paying a smaller price. So consumers benefit from innovative dynamism, but a lot of people would say, Diamond, okay, that's good, but I'm worried about my job. And if I have the price of these new goods is going to be that I'm going to have a precarious job and lose my job, that's too high a price. I've been told that. Well, I'm here to reassure you that it's not as it's better than a lot of people think. Innovation and the periods of innovation, more jobs are created than destroyed. This graph shows a period of 3 decades roughly. And it shows the green line is jobs created, the red dashed line are jobs destroyed. And this is a period that included stretches of substantial innovation, including the growth and flourishing of computers. And you notice the green line is almost always above the red dashed line, meaning the jobs created are almost always more than the jobs destroyed, and usually substantially so. The only exceptions in this graph are 4 periods of time, fairly brief periods of time during recessions. And so I think the worry about long-term substantial net job destruction is wrong. The innovation creates more jobs than are destroyed. Now you might respond to that, and people have sometimes responded. What exactly are these new jobs? Are these jobs mostly burger flipping at McDonald's? And I want to say the answer to that is no. The jobs created on balance are better jobs than the jobs destroyed. I have a couple of tables that suggest this. This table shows jobs over the 20th century. And on the left-hand column, it's jobs that were mainly destroyed over that period. The right-hand column shows jobs that were created over that period. Now, what I ask you to do is scan those jobs and ask yourself the question, do I like better the characteristics of the jobs that were created or the jobs that were destroyed? And what I'm going to suggest I conclude when I do that scan is that most of the jobs created are better jobs. The jobs that are destroyed tend to be jobs that are higher in danger, higher in physical exhaustion, higher in routine and boredom. The jobs created are more comfortable, less dangerous, involve more challenging work, more fulfillment. It's not true of every single one of them in either line, but I think on balance, this is a true claim. Another table shows this, I think, a similar story. This covers a shorter period of time, but a period of great technological change, the last decade of the 20th century, when the personal computers were growing, and we also had the internet growing. And this arranges jobs roughly in a hierarchy about the dominant tasks and skills that are involved in the job. So in the upper left-hand corner of this table, it's people skills and emotional intelligence, jobs that mainly involve that. And then just below that, imagination, creativity. And then at the very bottom on the right-hand side are the muscle power, manual dexterity jobs. Now, what I ask you to look at is the jobs underneath each of those categories. The jobs that are growing over this 10-year period are the jobs that are higher on the hierarchy, the ones that are better jobs, more involving people skills, imagination, reasoning. The ones that are declining during this period are the jobs that involve muscle power, manual dexterity, routine. So I think not only are there more jobs, they're better jobs during periods of time when there's innovative dynamism. But I don't want to leave this topic of how workers are affected without mentioning another way in which they're benefited. Workers are benefited not just because they have more and better jobs, they're also benefited because they have another opportunity that I think in some ways is even better than having a job, and that's being a free agent entrepreneur. Now, I distinguish between two kinds of entrepreneurs: free agent entrepreneurs and innovative entrepreneurs. And the difference is this: a free agent entrepreneur is a person who works for themselves doing something that's already been done before. An innovative entrepreneur is somebody who works for themselves doing something that hasn't been done before, that's new. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about the fellow who's in this slide, Jacob Davis. He's one of my favorite examples of a free agent entrepreneur. He immigrated to the United States in the mid 1800s, soon married and had a large family. He traveled around the United States to various places, also parts of Canada, trying to find a place and an occupation where he and his family could flourish. He mainly was a tailor, but he tried some other things too. He landed in 1870 in Reno, Nevada, had a small tailor shop there. A woman came into his shop one day. What he was doing was what he'd been doing for a while, which was mainly making blankets for horses. He made sturdy, cheap blankets. And one way that he made them sturdy was he had a pile of inexpensive copper rivets, and he would put those into the blankets in the weak spots in the blankets. The woman came in and she said, "I've got a problem. My husband is a big guy. He works hard in very tough labor, and he wears out his pants real quick. Right now, he doesn't have any pants to wear, and so he can't go work his job and bring us the money we need to buy food to survive. Can you make him a pair of pants that'll allow him to go work?" And so Jacob said, "I'll do what I can." He started cutting out the fabric, and a thought occurred to him. He saw that pile of rivets that he'd been using for the blankets, and he grabbed a couple of them and he started putting them into the parts of the pants that he knew were the ones that were most vulnerable to wearing out. Woman came in, bought the pants, took them home. He never saw her again. He did see her husband walking to work wearing those pants, and he saw something else that excited him. What he soon saw were people coming into his shop who he hadn't ever seen before, asking him to make another pair of pants just like that one. And he saw that he had a business. He had a product that people needed and wanted and were willing to buy. He went to his wife and said, "Can we take out a patent on this?" And she said, "Look, apparently he'd taken out a couple of other patents and they were not that well off. And it takes money to pay the patent fees and such." She said, "You haven't succeeded at that in the past. I don't think it's a very wise thing for us to take our scarce money and do." So he had another idea. He packaged up one of the pair of these plants. He mailed it off to Levi Strauss, somebody he had dealt with in San Francisco. Levi Strauss ran some department stores. He opened the package, looked at it. He looked at the letter. The letter said, "Will you pay the patent fee? If you'll pay the patent fee, we'll split the patent rights 50-50." Levi Strauss said, "This is a good idea." He did it. They went into business together. Jacob moved his family to San Francisco and started cranking out what became known as Levi jeans. I like this story for more than one reason. One reason I like this story is it shows that there's a continuum between being a free agent entrepreneur and being um, an innovative entrepreneur. And mainly Jacob Davis was a free agent entrepreneur doing what had been done before. A lot of people have tailored in the past. But when he picked up those rivets and had the idea of putting those rivets where they had never been put before to strengthen a pair of pants so a working person could keep their job, he was doing something important and innovative. And he became, at that moment, at least for a while, an innovative entrepreneur. Now, many of the people we remember mainly as innovative entrepreneurs spent some time as free agent entrepreneurs. You think about Walt Disney and Sam Walton were great innovative entrepreneurs. They, in their very early days as children, worked as newspaper boys. A newspaper boy is kind of a free agent entrepreneur. They buy the newspapers and they have to sell them. They have to deliver them on a dependable basis. Something else I like about this story is it illustrates something important about innovation and innovative dynamism, which is it provides paths for outsiders, for immigrants, for poor people, for the least well-off to make their lives better, to flourish, to have a go at it. By bringing new goods and sometimes the old goods to the rest of us, they flourish. And I think that's a neat thing about innovative dynamism. I think it's a bum rap that the capitalism is only a way to entrench the privileged. Entrepreneurial capitalism, what I call innovative dynamism, is the opposite. It's a way to provide opportunity for the least well-off. And finally, one thing with the story I want to emphasize and highlight is that it's characteristic of my book and my story is that a lot of what I've learned from generalizing on the basis of a deep dives into particular stories of innovative entrepreneurs. This is a little bit different approach than what's often used in economics, but I think sometimes you miss something if you don't do, occasionally at least, the fine-grained analysis where you look at the details. And that's something I wish I had more time to do this. I could spend hours with you going through cases that I love to tell people about, but I'm really only going to emphasize one other one, and that's my favorite entrepreneur, Walt Disney. Disney was born into a large, fairly poor family. They moved around a lot trying to find a place where they could flourish. They ended up in Kansas City when he was a young man, where he returned after World War I. He'd always loved cartooning, and he found a way to make a living doing cartooning, which was to work for little advertising firms, but also to work on his own as a free agent entrepreneur. And he moved back and forth between these kinds of opportunities in what I call in my book a robustly redundant labor market. And that's described, I have this book on this slide, Walt Before Mickey, and it's kind of a neat book because it describes the details of how Walt and his friends moved between these various opportunities, jobs, free agent entrepreneurs, back to a different job. And the nice thing about a robustly redundant labor market when it exists is that if you are fired, and Walt was once, or if you choose to leave a job for a better opportunity, there are other jobs available fairly quickly, fairly easily that are as good or better. And it's important that we can have that kind of labor market. It has and can exist. Well, he set up his first firm, his first startup, when he was 20 years old, called Laugh-O-Grams. It made small animated shorts, usually advertisements they would play before the main movie. And he did make some of these and bring in some money. But the problem he was having is his costs were greater than his revenue. And he didn't give up easy, though. What happened was he sought to cut all of his costs as low as possible. He moved out of his apartment and slept in his studio. He stopped eating in restaurants. He went and bought cans of cheap beans. He was growing skeletal, and his family and friends were worried about his health. He used to say later on in life, "Wasn't so bad. I actually like beans." He had a certain resilience, a character, perseverance that you often find in innovative entrepreneurs, and it's an admirable trait. I don't think it's born in people. I think they have to work at it usually. But in spite of his efforts, his best efforts, Laugh-O-Grams went bankrupt. Now, after a while, he picked himself up and he moved to Hollywood area. And with his brother, he started another little startup to make more animated cartoons. They started out in their uncle's garage. His first main character was this guy on the left in this slide. That's Oswald, the lucky rabbit. And they had a contractual agreement with Universal to distribute these animated cartoons, and the cartoons did pretty well. Like I said, it was his first major character. He wanted to extend the series, so he took a train out to New York and met with the middleman between him and Universal. And what he found out in the end was that they had made a decision to cut him out of the production of Oswald, bring in other cartoonists. And that was a pretty substantial blow to young Walt. On the train trip back, what did he do? I think he might have complained a little bit, but that's not mainly what he did. What he mainly did was sketch. And what he sketched was he took Oswald and he shortened Oswald's ears and he lengthened Oswald's tail. And he ended up with that guy you see on the right in this slide, right? Known to us now as Mickey Mouse. And Mickey Mouse was his second big successful character. And things started to go pretty well. The cartoons were well received. And what he did with the money from the cartoons was he made better cartoons. He put the money into better equipment. He hired the best animators he could find, and he paid some of the best ones more than he paid himself. He took the money from the early cartoons, he put into the latter cartoons. He took the money from the latter cartoons and decided on a really big project, which was to make a full-length animated film. And it was challenging, and people thought he was going to fail. But Snow White was a huge success. The skeptics were amazed at the lines of people waiting to get into Snow White. It was during the Great Depression. It was a dark story, but it was a story of optimism, perseverance, and hope. And that's what people needed and wanted during the Great Depression. And maybe they need and want that in other times as well. Well, he was a project entrepreneur. And I just want to say project entrepreneurs are the kind of entrepreneur are not in it for the mansion. They're not in it for the yacht. They're in it for the project. This train in the upper right corner. You say, why does Diamond have that on a slide? Well, his house wasn't very impressive. The only thing neat about his house was this train he had where he took neighborhood children going around the train. The picture at the bottom left captures, in my mind, the idea of a project entrepreneur. Mickey was the start of everything, and he built from project to project. And this is the last project. This was Disneyland on Main Street, USA. And he decided he wanted to do Disneyland. He started to have the ideas of it. He went to his brother, who was chief financial officer, and said, what do you think? Can we do this? And Roy said to him, Walt, we got all of our money tied up in these new movies, but we don't have enough to do this. And anyway, it's a crazy idea. Nobody thinks you're going to be able to succeed at making money with an amusement park. So Walt, you would have thought most people would have given up, but Walt didn't. He quit Walt Disney Productions, and he started a new startup called WED Enterprises, WED, Walter Elias Disney. And he didn't have any personal money to put into it because all of his money had gone from project to project. It was all tied up in the main company. So what did he do? He borrowed on his life insurance policy and used that to start the Disneyland project. Eventually, his brother said, you're a stubborn guy. We'll do the best we can. He pulled him back in, and the rest is history. Well, Walt Disney had personal characteristics. That's one generalization. He also was intense. I think that's something worth mentioning. He was intense in what he demanded of himself. He was intense in what he asked of his workers. And that's a question we have to ask ourselves. Regulations today increasingly restrict the ability of entrepreneurs to ask a lot of their workers, to ask for intensity. But the case that Walt would make, and I think it's a plausible possible case, is that in the service of big goals like Snow White, like Disneyland, it's reasonable to ask people who voluntarily sign on to intensity. And that's what he was allowed to do and what he did. These are some of the generalizations that I make about all of the cases that I study and that I mention in the book, including the Walt Disney case. Innovators have certain characteristics. I've mentioned perseverance. One generalization I make is that often the poor people are the people who turn out to be the innovators, the people who are outsiders. And I think that's an important characteristic of innovation. But what I focus on most are what are the thought processes of innovators? How do they do it? And I've identified three characteristics I think are often important: alertness to serendipity, pursuit of inchoate slow hunches, Nimble Trial and Error Experiment. The reason I have this book in this slide is that it's a book, a neat book about Charles Goodyear. Goodyear did each of these three. His long-term goal, he had this hunch that raw rubber could be made into something that would be useful for raincoats, for boots, for a whole bunch of different purposes. The problem was raw rubber is melty and sticky at high temperatures and is brittle at low temperatures. So it only really works well in a fairly narrow range. The question is, how could you modify it to make it work well in all reasonable temperatures? He tried all kinds of mixtures. He tried all kinds of ways of cooking it. He had it on a stove at one point, I think with a little sulfur mixed in, and he accidentally spilled some and didn't realize it, left for a while. Here's where the serendipity comes in. Came back, and there was this piece. He pulled it off, and it was pliable, just what he had been seeking to do. And he did that through, in the end, and lucky break at the end of nimble trial and error experiments. Well, if those are the characteristics by which innovation usually occurs, then that has implications for what we can do to either encourage innovation or to block it. And this has been pointed out in, I think, a very astute way by this gentleman. This is Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, and he said that regulation prohibits real innovation because the regulation essentially defines a path to follow. If a lot of what goes into innovation is the result of nimble trial and error experiment, if it's a result of seeing serendipity, you can't predict serendipity. You can't predict what's going to happen out of nimble trial and error experiment. And therefore, the innovator themselves don't know the path that's going to be followed. They know they're going to persevere and find a path, but they don't know what that path is in advance. And if they don't know, how can any regulator know? So if the regulator restricts the path, they're going to be restricting paths that would have worked and restricting innovations that would have happened. And that, if my story is right in what I just told you, then this graph is a sad one, because this graph shows that over the recent decades, we've had a huge and continuing, with a couple of tiny short pauses, increase in regulations. This is if it is a problem, it's a problem that's been increasing and continues to increase. One person who thinks it's a problem and experienced it just a couple months ago is Elon Musk, who is one of our boldest and most ambitious innovative entrepreneurs. He wants to give us a pathway to Mars, and he's experimenting with rockets that he thinks will be designed to get that job done. I think it was back in January, the FAA shut down some of his rocket experiments, and he was, as you would expect, enormously frustrated and made this comment that under the rules the FAA was imposing on him, humanity will never reach Mars unless we change those rules. But you may say to me, well, that's no big deal. I don't want to go to Mars. So if we don't go to Mars, who cares? Personally, I wouldn't mind having a chance to go to Mars, but I understand what you're saying. But let me ask you this. Would you like to cure cancer? Would you like to have more medicines and vaccines to cure other diseases? And I think almost everyone will say yes to that. That kind of innovation, I think almost everybody buys into. One person who bought into wanting that kind of innovation was this guy, Sergey Brin. He was the co-founder of Google and is fairly one of the richer people in the country. And he wanted to use some of his wealth to advance medical innovation. But when he started looking into it, he saw there's huge obstacles. He concluded the burden of regulations is very high on medical regulators, and it discouraged him from the enthusiasm he initially had when he started to want to get into that. I think you can find even stronger evidence from somebody who has tried hard and had some success at medical innovation. This is a wonderful book, The Death of Cancer by Vincent DeVita. He's got wonderful credentials. DeVita was director of the National Cancer Institute. He was head of the director of the Yale Cancer Institute. He was a chief doctor at Memorial Sloan Kettering's cancer operations. But most importantly, when he was a young doctor, he worked with Emil Freireich, who had a team that engaged in nimble trial and error experiments week by week to make modifications in their chemotherapy cocktail to try and develop a combination of doses and drugs that would cure childhood leukemia. And it was hard, and they almost were shut down more than once, but finally they reached a cocktail that did cure many children of that terrible disease. DeVita, when he was further along, used the same technique with his team to develop a cure for Hodgkin's lymphoma for many patients, not all patients, but for many patients. Nimble, trial and error with a chemo cocktail. In this book, he says what the FDA is doing now is restricting what doctors can do in terms of nimble trial and error experiments. They're forcing them to stick to protocols. And what DeVita says is people are dying who don't need to die because doctors are being restricted from innovating in ways that will cure people from these terrible diseases. I want to end with just a couple of words about another of my favorite entrepreneurs. This is Wilbur Wright. We talk about the Wright brothers, but the one who was the main innovator was Wilbur. Orville helped. Wilbur's key innovation was not to figure out how to get airborne. Other people had figured that. The key innovation that Wilbur had was how do you control the landing? And that's a desirable thing. I think we would all agree. He figured out how to do that. And it's an interesting story how he did that. But what I want to tell you about is after he figured it out, they had some demonstration flights. And one of the most impressive demonstration flights was flying the first airplane that had ever flown over the island of Manhattan. Wilbur did that. They say that nearly 1 million people flowed into the streets of Manhattan cheering as Wilbur Wright flew his airplane overhead. And at some point in the flight, he changed direction and somebody yelled, he's headed to Jersey. But Wilbur wasn't headed to Jersey. Wilbur was flying out over the water because before he landed, he wanted to give a nod to the Statue of Liberty. I at one point wanted to use this photo as a cover of my book, but Oxford University Press vetoed that. The photo's too old, too grimy. But photos can be cleaned up, and economic systems can be cleaned up too. If we give a nod to liberty, if we lower the restrictions on our inventors and our innovators, they'll bring us rockets that can take us to Mars. They'll bring us faster cures to cancer. They will bring us wonderful innovations that we at the moment can't even imagine. One thing that is for sure is they'll bring us more goods, more jobs, more choices. They'll bring us more life, more hope. I thank Derek for giving me the opportunity to talk to you, and I thank you very much for your time and attention.